Welcome, everyone. My name is Chelsea Roff. I'm the founder and director of Eat, Breathe, Thrive, and I'm so happy to be here with George Mycock of MyoMinds. George, thanks for making time to be with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice to be here. I'm looking forward to speaking.
Me too. Me too. And we've only just met, so I've gotten to know you a little bit just in our short conversation. But I wondered, do you want to just introduce yourself, who you are, what brought you to this conversation, and what your work with MyoMinds looks like?
Yeah, sure. So, as Chelsea said, my name's George. I am the founder of MyoMinds, which is a mental health organization that works in what I call exerciser mental health. So we focus on things like exercise addiction, body dysmorphia, and eating disorders, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Um, I have my own kind of lived experience with muscularity orientated forms of disordered eating and exercise addiction and muscle dysmorphia. I've not been diagnosed with them officially, although I'm actually, as someone who works in the muscle dysmorphia space quite a lot, I'm yet to meet anyone who is. I think it's that maybe that's something we can talk about as we go on. But yeah, it's very uncommon. But yeah, through MyoMinds, I do research into eating disorders, publish the paper occasionally. I work on training tools and different tools to help kind of the people who are going through it, and also people who are trying to help the people who are going through it. And I also host the MyoMinds podcast, where I speak to professionals, and I'm the other way around as I am here today. So yeah, I'm excited to kind of be the interviewee.
I love being the interviewer. It's much more comfortable often to be on this side of the mic. Well, George, we've called this series Stories of Recovery. So I'm glad that you spoke to having a lived experience right off the bat. And I guess I'll share. I also have a lived experience of an eating disorder, and running this organization. I've always been struck by the assumptions that come with the term eating disorder. So I find that if I'm out at like a networking event or even just a party or meeting people and they say, "What do you do for work?" And I say, "Oh, I run a charity that supports people with eating disorders." Often I get a response that's like, "Oh, wow, that's amazing. I've always, I'm so passionate about women's work." And I'm like, I didn't say anything about women, or like, oh wow, it's got to be so great to work with, young girls. And I'm like, I didn't say anything about youth or girls. So I wonder, I'm happy you named that right off the bat. I wonder if just off the bat you'd be willing to share a little bit of how you understand that term eating disorder, whether you feel included in that kind of, term and the connotations that come with it, and what your experience with whatever term you use to describe your experience, whether that's eating disorder or disordered eating, has been. That's a huge question. Sorry, right off the
Yeah,
bat.
it is a huge question, but it is. I don't think there's any other way of you asking it. Um, I guess yeah, like the talking about the connotations around it. Obviously I could say the definitions of eating disorder or whatever, but I think more so in this sense, if we're talking about these connotations. And I definitely agree with you. I was talking to a moment ago about how sometimes I'll speak with media through my own mind's work, and often they'll talk about how they're trying to promote diversity within eating disorders and trying to work on these different aspects of trying to talk about expand eating disorders. And then they'll say, oh, that's fantastic, so how many like men have you spoken to? And then they'll say, what, like but we don't, we're obviously not men. But yeah, men they also get eating disorders. And I think it's something that you kind of very commonly come across when you are in the eating disorder world, is this kind of um skepticism of there being a male version of this, and also the kind of stigma around being a man with an eating disorder. And I think often that's due to several reasons, but I think it's quite a feminized space, in the sense that it is everything that you see in eating disorders tends to be, it's either it is a picture of a woman on the leaflet, or there's these kind of things. And I think I once spoke on my podcast with a comedian called Dave Chawner, who's fantastic, and he had lived experience with eating disorder as well. And he said that, you know, when he visits services, it would always be like footprints in the sand with a poem, and then like a rainbow with a butterfly. And then he said, you know, he just, as a man walking in there, he just didn't feel like it was his space. And I guess it's the same for a lot of people. And I guess, yeah, eating disorder, to me, it's a difficult one, because like you rightly mentioned, there's a difference between eating disorder and disordered eating. And I think technically what I was under, because I wasn't diagnosed, was disordered eating. And also, even if I got to the point where I was being assessed for an eating disorder, the behaviors that I exhibited and still do sometimes to a degree, were more orientated towards muscularity and becoming more muscular, trying to be more muscular. And the typical kind of eating disorder symptoms that people would look for to diagnose wouldn't correlate with that. So I don't think I would actually be diagnosed, or potentially not anyway. So it's really, yeah, it is very kind of difficult to nail down. Yeah, I think to me it doesn't feel like something, I was going to say it doesn't feel like something I'm welcome in, but maybe I do feel now, because I've spoken more and I've pushed myself into this space. And but I think it's also partly because of the community I've created accept this idea. But I do think it's always shocking to me when I meet people in the space, even people who have been in the space for a long time, and I mention muscularity or I mention men, and there's confusion and, oh, I've never heard of that. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'm just turning over. There's so many threads that we could follow there. I'm hearing sort of two things that I wonder more about, more than that actually. But one is, you mentioned, you know, you could talk about the definitions of eating disorders, but one kind of theme in that is the problems with diagnosis, right? So we've got, you know, we've got the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and the ICD, which have really clear categories of diagnosis. You've got anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and a host of other ones that have come out in the most recent iteration. But I guess one thing I wonder about is some of the behaviors that you've said, you know, were part of your experience, maybe aren't even mentioned in those. So I guess, so that's one category to think about. And the other is the stigma and the assumptions that people have, maybe not stigma, but the cultural ideas about what eating disorders are. So they're two really separate things.
I think,
maybe,
sorry,
go for it. Yeah.
Sorry, I know you were about to suggest, but I'm just going to do it anyway.
I love it.
I was going to say that I think the symptoms that I showed, and I think the people who experience this muscularity stuff do technically align with the symptoms that people would look forward for diagnoses. But I think there's still a connotation of, this is the behavior is this, but it's also in this kind of body and this kind of person. So it's not just restrictive eating, it's restrictive eating in someone who is female and thin. Whereas if a guy comes in restrictive eats, oh, he's just working on his diet, or he's just, you know, trying to get shredded, or, you know, there's a difference there. And I always tell this story about this one time I went to my local GP for something completely like different, and he was looking through my files and said, oh, it says here that you have some kind of like disordered eating thing going on, but you don't look like you've got a disordered eating. And he kind of like flexed his arm at me, and as he said it, and you know, and I laughed with him. I was like, yeah, I like obviously don't have because this was still when I was in it. I was like, yeah, I obviously don't do that, because, like, you know, I've got muscles, so I can't be someone who has, you know, got an eating disorder or got something wrong with me. And that's where that problem is with the kind of diagnoses or the eating disorder, at least as far as I see it. And that's why I'm trying to like raise awareness for this stuff, and yeah, some of the tools that I'm making with MyoMinds, one of them at the moment is around excessive exercise as part of an eating disorder. And we've made now, it's just not been released yet, an animation about people's lived experience. And one of those people's lived experience is a man with muscularity orientated things. And then we've got a training program that goes along with it, one that is for GPs and one that is for like personal trainers and coaches, so that they can recognize it as well. And like doing things like that is what I'm hoping is going to break down that barrier, so people can look, I guess, objectively at the symptoms and not place them within that kind of connotation, which is difficult because, you know, we're all human, and I'm not trying to, you know, I'm sure I do it too in different situations, but yeah, that's where that kind of struggle is.
I'm so glad you stepped in there and clarified that, because you're right. It may not even be a problem with the diagnostic criteria, but biases in the individuals doing the diagnosing. And that's, you know, like you said, we're all human and we all have frailties and biases, but it might actually be a problem of when we see when we see men, or what we think of as men. Sometimes we even make assumptions on gender. When we see them acting in those behaviors, it's perceived as a healthy thing, or like a, and I know we're going to talk about masculinity, you know, today, but oh, it's just a guy going, you know, going to the gym and pushing hard and getting shredded, like you said. So that's, I'm really glad you brought that up. I feel like especially not knowing you, I have a ton of questions intellectually I want to ask you, but I also, I'm curious about you, what your experience was, and I feel like it's almost hard to go into some of those intellectual curiosities without like kind of actually connecting with you on a human level and
Yeah.
understanding what brought you to be interested in this and to be doing this work. So yeah, I guess when was, one question I have is when was the first time you recognized that whatever you were doing was a problem and was causing you issues? That what was that kind of point of awareness, especially when you're maybe in a culture surrounded by people that either celebrate it or ignore it, or, you know, put it off as something healthy? And what did it look like in your life?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to do like a prelude up to it, because I think it'll be a good like context. But I think like a lot of men, in my opinion, this is what I'm going to be researching in my PhD. When I was younger, I developed this kind of internalized discrepancy in masculinity, in the sense that I saw my dad as this masculine figure that I was supposed to adhere to, and he was very hardworking. He was a like rugby player in our local area, and he was kind of like well known for being someone who would, you know, like break his finger but carry on, or like, you know, break his nose and carry. He was that person. And I've always been very sensitive, like all my entire life I've always been very sensitive, and I was told that was okay, but also like my dad got all this respect for not being the way that I was, so I always felt like I wasn't quite there. And this is something we see quite common in the people who have this high drive for muscularity. So a way that I tried to earn this masculinity back was originally through rugby. So I played rugby as well, and then when I was 13, I broke my back, I broke my spine, and I had to have surgery to hold it together, which was obviously horrible. And then basically I couldn't play rugby anymore. I gained a lot of weight. I started to kind of get these body image issues, and I turned to like, you know, trying out different dietary methods and exercising more. And I found that the less I ate and the more I exercised, the more weight I lost. And I found the more weight I lost, the more people congratulated me and praised me. And, you know, there's that funny thing where it doesn't matter, you know, if you're in an overweight body and you lose weight, people don't care how you do it or how fast it's happening. People just love that you're doing it, and you just get congratulated no matter what, which is a problem. And that's what happened to me. I was, you know, if there was someone who was a quote unquote normal weight and losing weight at the rate I was, everyone would be panicking. But because I was overweight, it was completely fine, and it was encouraged. Even my doctors were encouraging me. And, you know, obviously they didn't know the actual extent I was going to, but it got to the point where I was basically just severely restricting. And then as a teenager who was using like, you know, exercise and diet as a way to kind of get this respect back and this masculinity back, I delved into the fitness community to see what I should adhere to, and I saw all these very muscular men, and thought, okay, that's what I'm supposed to be. And then I started to kind of change the way that I ate and trained, and in a way that made me think I could obtain that. So I started trying to eat more, and then I thought, you know, a way that I can eat more but still stay lean would be to make myself sick afterwards, and so I started doing that. Obviously it doesn't work that way, but that's what I thought would work, and it kind of went on from there. And I think at the moment I realized it was a problem was in like my first or second year of university. But the reason I did this context was because when I was within this fitness community, and this is an area that I'm really interested in, so I'm going to try and keep this concise, but there's the research that I'm looking into, it's really funny that the values of the fitness community and the values of masculinity are almost perfectly aligned. They both talk about working really hard and putting in effort. They both talk about taking up space and becoming bigger, becoming more muscular. They both talk about ignoring your they both talk about being able to endure pain. So masculinity and the fitness community talk about enduring pain, and they both talk about this idea that they term battling the self in the kind of fitness community stuff, but I think it's seen in masculinity as well, which is the idea that your mind and your body will tell you you're supposed to stop. So in the fitness community, it's like, the exercise will hurt, or you'll feel tired, but it's your responsibility to push through that anyway. And in the masculinity community, it's you'll feel tired that you don't want to go to work and earn that money, or you don't need to like go after that person you're interested in or whatever, but it's your responsibility as a man to go. So they both push this idea. And so you become enclosed in this world of fitness and masculinity. And as part of that as well, which is, no one's done this research specifically, but there's research in athletes that show a similar thing, which is that when someone gets enclosed in a very specific community, and one that, this specifically in sports, one that encourages some form of extremity, in the sense with exercise in the athlete community, your social circle becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, because you do an extreme behavior and become rewarded, so you decide to go a little bit more extreme, and then people around you think that's too extreme, and they start to mention that to you, but you don't like that, obviously, because you're getting negativity, so you cut them out. So then your social circle is smaller, with only the people that accept your extreme behavior. So suddenly the threshold of what's extreme has gone up. So then you do a little bit more extreme and it gets smaller, a little bit more extreme. And that's basically what happened with me. Was I had this incredibly small community of only the people on Instagram, and only my friends who went to the gym, and only the people who did the extreme stuff I did. So there was no way I was ever going to think that I had a problem, or ever think that it was a problem. And it took me getting to the point where I think the only time I really thought it was an actual problem was my second year at university, where I got to the point where I was considering suicide. And I was, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't want to hurt anyone here, but I was practicing like what I was going to do, and I was thinking about it, and I was and luckily one of my friends came to my house. I'd locked myself away for about 2 weeks and just was binge eating on food, and my friend came and said, and for some reason I kind of opened up to her, and I ended up going to see a counselor, and then it kind of went from there. But yeah, I guess that's kind of a roundabout way of what I went through, and what led to that point where I eventually, it took such an extreme moment for me to recognize that there was anything wrong. Otherwise, I just thought it was, another thing I'm supposed to push through as a man, and also as a member of the fitness community. And that's something I'm really interested in. I will shut up here, sorry. But something I'm really interested in is with that battle in the self, and when that masculinity and the fitness community intertwine, how are you supposed to know the difference between one of the things that you're supposed to push through because it's your responsibility to, because you don't want to be weak, and something that needs help, like something that needs medical attention? And we talk so much about men not seeking help, not going to the doctors and stuff, and I think this is one of the key contributors to it. So yeah.
It's so interesting. I always turn myself on mute, so you can't hear my ums and ahs, and interesting, fascinating. But I've just been doing that the entire time you've spoken. I didn't want to interrupt you, but one thing that occurred to me as you were describing that kind of insular community becoming more and more insular, and the extreme behaviors causing you to get more isolated in that community, and in that community celebrating more extreme. I mean, I thought of a lot of things in my own experience, but it's also the process of radicalization. Like that's exactly when we're thinking like completely outside of anything related to eating disorders. That's how radicalization happens in with ideas. So that's really, really interesting, that kind of social, for lack of a better word, process you just described of how, if you think of an eating disorder as a particular radical form of a health regime, you know, that's gone awry, and you can think of, you know, terrorism as a particularly radical, you know, a radical form of what maybe started as a religious belief or something like that. Of course, it's far more complex than that.
That's really that's not something I've thought about before.
I hadn't thought about it until you just spoke, and I'm like, wow, that's really, really interesting. So I think about that, but my experience kind of, well, we had, I think of, you're talking about fitness and masculinity. I'm an athlete, and that is so true, not just in the fitness community, but athleticism, those values you were speaking to of, you know, push through, and it leading to injuries. And then I'll also say from my experience as an eating disorder, my community wasn't the fitness community. I was really young. It was pro anorexia communities. And it was like early days, I'm going to age myself, you know, GeoCities, Angel Fire, MySpace stuff. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry. I'm getting old. But those, you know, just tiny little internet communities of people posting this and celebrating it as a health regime, you know, like you don't need food. You can just take vitamins every day. And I think there's a parallel process happening now with Instagram, and you're seeing this with social media and youth at the moment. So I'm so glad you articulated that process, and I think you've just given people who might be listening and going like, were those really, like, I think so many people when they hear about men and eating disorders go, oh, but like, is muscularity, is that really a problem? Or they question it and they doubt it. And the fact that what I heard you say is the moment you really knew it was a problem is when you became suicidal. That to me is heartbreaking and heart-wrenching. And it's what we know about eating disorders. It's got one of the highest mortality rates of any mental illness, and it's cardiovascular issues and suicide. Those are the two. So you have just described a hallmark eating disorder that probably wasn't recognized by you and the people around you. And if anything, it was celebrated by your medical professionals. So I'm so sorry that you had that experience, but thank you for sharing it, because I think it's really important people hear it.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I guess obviously this talk is about men's experiences, but I also wanted to say that although I'm really interested in the men's experience of muscularity stuff, but muscularity stuff can be in women as well, and it is. There's research coming out more now showing that it is. But yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, the kind of social media aspect that you were talking about there. There's like, you know, I think we all are aware of the kind of pro ana websites where they kind of suggest these like anorexia behaviors. There's also pro muscularity websites, and people have done analyses of that. And you know, there's a lot on there. Again, it's kind of in fact the study that I'm thinking of was by a guy called Scott Griffiths, I think. Maybe Stuart Murray, but basically they compared pro anorexia and pro muscularity websites and found all the similarities, and they are very similar. But the muscularity websites are obviously talking about muscularity, but there was such extreme stuff as like one person said, you know, I don't care if you have to like skip your nan's funeral to get that workout in. You have like, you know, or if you haven't got the money for food, you might have to steal it, and that's like, but you just got to do because that's what you got to do. And you know, to these extremities, but it's so like, you know, nobody's in there calling it out. Everyone's in there like, yeah, like, you know, I think there's almost like a fear of, because there's this masculinity tied into there, and these people tend to be so dependent on masculinity as a form of you know, self-worth, that the idea of if something is a quote unquote masculine, has a masculine twinge to it, if you call that out, are you then like belittling the thing that you think gives you self-worth? And you kind of get stuck in this little vortex, I guess. So yeah, it's
Echo
really,
chamber.
yeah, echo chamber.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm listening and I feel like I have a sense of it, but there may still be people listening that don't.
Mm,
Can you speak to especially as a woman, when I talk to people about work with eating disorders and I talk about men and their struggles, there is that doubt. It's like, whoa, is it really an eating disorder? And I have this also not just with men, but like if I'm when I explain to people over and over again that people deserve eating disorder treatment, whether they're under an 18 BMI or not, or
mm,
whether they're severely underweight or not, and talk about kind of the dangers of purging, the dangers of over exercising, all of that. It's I feel like that's not something that most people understand. Could you speak to, like, if you had somebody listening right now, let's imagine it's, I don't know, my grandfather or my uncle who's like listening and going, is that really an eating disorder? Have you just, expanded the definition of eating
mm.
disorder? Can you speak to how you understand what an eating disorder is, and in particular, why these struggles that you're talking about, um, oh, I shouldn't even ask this, but why they're deserving of
Mm.
legitimacy and our concern, and how, the impact they can have psychologically, physically, socially, etc.
Mm.
Huge question to ask.
No, no. But
Yeah.
firstly, I want to say, you said you shouldn't even ask this, but you definitely should ask. That's an
Okay.
incredibly important question. I think I understand why you're like you shouldn't, but you definitely should. And yeah, I guess I understand why people are saying that, especially when you see people who are like severely underweight, and you think, oh, why would you give it to this muscular person when you could give it to someone who's like that? I guess the first answer is, and again, this is maybe one that you get quite often, or people in this community will have heard quite often, but eating disorders are a mental health issue. They're not physical, in the sense that it doesn't matter what person looks like. It's the kind of thing that's going on in their head. So people like myself can still lead on to suicide, and have these kind of severely kind of negative effects in the mental health. And we know that men have the highest suicide rate. It's like it's, I think it's three out of four suicides are men. So that men are in are danger to suicide, and eating disorders can lead to suicidal ideation and suicidal behavior. And also, just to touch on as well, the kind of the when I was talking about that idea of confusion as to whether I'm supposed to help, like, do something about this emotion or not, there's a term called alexithymia, which you might have heard of before, but this, for people who don't, it's basically this this idea of not understanding or being able to recognize and kind of name, I suppose, emotions that you're feeling. And it's something that's really common in men, and it's called normative alexithymia when people learn it. And normative alexithymia is really closely linked to suicidal behavior and suicidal ideation. So men with eating disorders are in this world that I've explained earlier, where you're told, ignore your emotions. All this confusion around whether it's right to have them or whatever, and that basically is like this perfect cacophony of generating alexithymia, and then alexithymia leads to suicidal ideation, or at least it's incredibly linked to it. So these eating disorders are potentially forcing people towards this suicidal behavior, and I'm sure that is the case in a lot of eating disorders, but specifically in this case. And then just to touch on the kind of physiological aspects of it, a lot of the issues that come with eating disorder behaviors, like physiologically, some of them do come from the fact that you've kind of stripped away so much of your body that it isn't running properly anymore. But a lot of them come from the fact that I actually did my master's degree in nutrition, so I understand this relatively well. But a lot of it comes from the fact that you've been restrictive for a certain amount of time, that your body doesn't currently have the levels that are needed. And also, a lot of, if your body's going to is in that severely kind of starvation mode, a lot of the times what it'll turn to is body fat levels. And someone who has muscularity can still have extremely low levels of body fat if they're severely restricting, which is what the research has shown. The case studies that we've looked at is these men still have things like bradycardia, where they kind of have like a dodgy rhythm to their heart, which can lead to different issues. They can still have, I think Jason Nagata recently published some paper around, I think it was like zinc levels, which I'm no medical doctor, but they kind of lead to issues in eating disorders, and men tend to have as high or even higher levels of zinc in their blood, which seems to show some kind of issue. I can't really talk on that because I'm not on Jason Nagata's holy level, but yeah, so there are all these issues. And also one interesting point as well, another paper that Jason Nagata pointed out recently was even when men go into an eating disorder service, this isn't really answering your question, but it's something I thought of, that you tend to, when you go into eating disorder service and you are severely restricted, you actually, you get, so there's the thing about zinc levels. And then also another paper, which is kind of slightly not related, but Jason Nagata spoke about was, or is published, was looking at when people are like kind of a very low body weights and they go into services, they often have to go through a refeeding process where they kind of slowly and gradually kind of refeed. And this paper did analysis across services in the US, and they found that men tend to get put on, even men who need a higher level of calories because of just because they're men for partly, and also because of like body mass and their kind of like muscularity, they get put on the same levels of refeeding, which actually has resulted in men having to stay in inpatient services longer on average. So that I guess that kind of again links to this issue of the kind of blindness of men in eating disorders, in the sense that even those services were just giving them the same that they would give to women, even though it was leading to them staying longer because it wasn't enough for them, which is, yeah, I suppose, upsetting. But the to go back to your question of like, you know, why do they deserve help? I'm hoping I've semi-answered it here, in the sense that, yeah, one, it's this mental health issue, and we know that men's mental health is an issue at the moment. We know that suicide is really high in men, and we know that men aren't speaking about things, and we know it comes from this alexithymia. And as I've explained earlier, I think that links in with these eating disorders and this masculinity issue kind of going on. And second, you know, even though someone has a higher BMI because of their potentially because of their levels of muscularity, it doesn't mean that they're excluded from the physiological symptoms. Like, they can still experience those physiological kind of problems that come with an eating disorder, even when in a higher BMI body, and anyone can. But yeah, it's just, I hope that answers the question.
It's a great answer. Yeah, I think in addition even to some of the physiological elements you spoke to, there's also electrolyte levels as well. So, you know, and that seems like a really small thing, but if you throw your electrolytes out too much, either through over exercise or purging, you can cause disruptions in heart rhythms, and so you've got really high rates of cardiovascular issues. What you say about alexithymia, you're connecting so many dots for me, George. I remember when I was in really early eating disorder recovery, having a partner once who used to say that I was a bit autistic. And I'm just going, oh, interesting. That he was probably naming like a bit of alexithymia, that like inability to name emotions. So that was a kind of aha. And I'm also just thinking, you know, we'll get into it, but just keep thinking about how and why yoga can be so helpful, and that ability of that skill of being able to name one's own experience, whether it's an emotion or a sensation, a feeling of hunger, a feeling of anxiety, a feeling of loneliness. I think, you know, and yoga, mindfulness, meditation can be so useful. But I have more questions for you. Oh, did you want to speak to that?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I agree with the fact that, yeah, I think that's a good way. That's where mindfulness and meditation and yoga and other practices can come in. Is like I kind of mentioned that alexithymia in that kind of 3-stage process of the eating disorder and masculinity issues, then it seems to lead to alexithymia, and then that leads to this suicidal ideation. If we can do, that's kind of the bridge. So if we can start to tackle that through these things, I think that's why, like, you know, I think that's why we see in research that mindfulness practice and things works. I think that's part of the reason why is that it helps people recognize what the actual problem is, and then also be able to talk about it and go from there. I suppose it's impossible to unravel something if you don't know, like, you don't know where the end is. Like, you got to I feel like the yoga and the meditation is figuring out where the end is of the yarn, and then you can start to pull it. Yeah.
That's so interesting. We talk so much at Eat Breathe Thrive about yoga building interoception, so your ability to name sensations happening in your body. So the sensations that let you know you're hungry, the sensations, grumbling, movement, the sensations that let you know that you're feeling anxious, heart rate speeding up, tense, all that stuff. I've never thought about yoga as we also talk about yoga as self-regulation. So when you know you're feeling anxious, having a practice you can do to bring your heart rate down, to calm down, to self-soothe, etc. When you know you're feeling tired, to have a practice you can do to recharge and re-nourish. But I've never thought about it with alexithymia, and they really go hand in hand. That ability to name sensations. If you think of, and I'm getting theoretical, but if you think of emotions as, and as it depends on your theory of emotion. There's a few, if you go way back into history of psychology, they would have arguments about this. But if you think of an emotion as emerging from a physiological state in the body, being able to name those sensations also helps you to be able to name, oh, I'm feeling really, I'm feeling fearful, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling tense. So that's fascinating. And that being, I've never thought of it also as being something to address that suicidality piece. And I know that to someone that might be listening that isn't so familiar with this, that might seem really extreme. Like, wait, a person can't name how they're feeling, and that somehow all of a sudden leads to suicide. But we see suicidality, suicidal feelings and suicidal thoughts are incredibly common in people that struggle with eating disorders. And I've never seen that. I've never thought of that bridge of that inability to name how you're feeling. If you can't name how you're feeling, you're just on a roller coaster you can't get off of. And you don't know what roller coaster you're on or when it's going to end or where it's going to take you. But that's a terrifying feeling. No wonder people want to tap out of that. No wonder I wanted to tap out of that.
I think that the issue is that you, for one, if you aren't aware of what it is that's going on, one, you don't know that you're supposed to be regulating it. Like, you don't know that this is a thing. Like I've mentioned before, how am I supposed to know if this is a thing I'm supposed to try and get help with, or I'm supposed to ignore? And then also, if you don't fully understand what it is that you're feeling, then you can start to generate a lot of like shame around it. And that's something that I experienced. Was I would start to think that maybe I was just really scared of everything, and I was like I thought I was like a wimp. Like, I thought, why am I scared of everything? When really it was anxiety. It was something that was actually like a struggle, or there was something that happened that day that made me upset for a reason, and that's like making me upset now in the gym, or making me feel anxious in the gym. And I was in there like, why am I scared? Like, why am I scared of being in here? Like, and I felt shamed of that, and that kind of bottled up inside. And then I started to, you start to hate yourself for the shame, like, for this shameful thing. And then so it escalates. It isn't necessarily, it does make sense that someone would be like, oh, you don't know, you can't name an emotion, so therefore you're gonna like think of suicide. But it's not that. It's the knock on. It's because you can't name it, then you think this, and then because you think that, you think this, and there's no, that it's all built on this structure. It's a pillar on that alexithymia, and then it builds up to that level.
And on top of that, to have all the cultural pressure, to be a man, to suck it up, to be able to know what to do. I feel like there's the ideas about masculinity and what it means to be a man on top of all of that is just, I think it's I used to say, it's been a long time because I try not to put it in a better or worse, but I used to say, I actually think that men that struggle with the idea that there's like eating disorders are a women's issue or a female issue. I used to think, well, I think men actually have it a lot harder, because in addition to struggling with the thing itself, they also have to deal with all of the cultural ideas around not being able to express feelings, you should have your stuff figured out, you should be able to take care of your family, you should be, you should be stoic in all of it. Like at least with women, there's some space in our society for a woman to say, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling ashamed, I don't know what to do, I'm having mental health struggles. I feel like there's all this pressure, and in addition to the issue itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I want to ask you, because I feel like we've gotten to a point where if somebody's listening and is like not sure this is a real issue, hopefully, maybe if they've got really bad alexithymia, no, that's a terrible joke, but hopefully we've made a case that this is definitely a legitimate issue, and it's one to be taken with as much seriousness, like care and concern, as any other type of eating disorder, anorexia, bulimia, and also that it is all of those as well. I wonder if somebody's listening and recognizing a partner, a brother, a father, a friend in this conversation and going, I have someone in my life, or maybe let's keep it that. Don't make the question bigger. If they're recognizing someone they know and care about in this conversation, and they're going, I don't even know where to start on how to help, how to breach that conversation, how to be of support, do you have any advice, thoughts, tips?
I think one key thing that I try and talk about is, I think, like I said before, for a lot of these men, but also I think women who are experiences as well, masculinity can be the base of it. This idea that they're not masculine enough and they need to be it, and then they adopt these behaviors to try and kind of make that space smaller. So I think often what we think, our first gut reaction is, well, they need to not care about being masculine anymore. And especially in the world now where we talk about toxic masculinity and the kind of issues that are in there, and we kind of we've denounced it as this kind of issue. I think it's important for these people. I think this saying to this person that masculinity is stupid, you should forget it, is the same as saying to someone with an eating disorder, like, oh, why don't you just eat some more? Or saying to someone who has depression, like, oh, why don't you just look on the bright side of life? Or it just doesn't work. You can't just, if someone's built their whole life on this idea that they need this thing, or there's this kind of mental health struggle there, it's really hard to get them to not do it. So I think one thing that you can do with people who are experiencing it like this is show them positive forms of masculinity that they can adhere to and get that boost from in another way. And it's something that we see in the research that looks at men who have really high drive for muscularity, is it tends to be a very similar timeline, and then they get into this space where they have kind of issues in their life, like the kind of issues, the kind of the problems they have with it kind of slide up and down. That either gets worse or gets better, and the things that change that are these life moments where they reassess their masculinity based on what's going on. So one really common one is people start to feel better if they become a dad, because, oh, I don't need to do these behaviors anymore because now I'm a man, because I've got a child and I'm going to look after my son, or my daughter, or whatever. So that's masculine. Or you could talk to someone about how being masculine can be just being assured of yourself, or working on your own confidence in who you are as a person and being okay with who you are. Or being masculine can be your ability to even embrace your emotions and feel comfortable in feeling sad and feeling okay, and being able to talk about that and not feel ashamed about it. There's ways that you can, because we call it masculinity and femininity, and I think originally that was because we labeled it as a man and woman thing, but masculinity and femininity aren't gendered. They can be for anyone. Everyone is masculine in some way and everyone is feminine in another way. So they are kind of wishy-washy. They can move about. So help that person find another form of masculinity, embrace that, and that's it's an okay thing, but just find nice ways around it, I think is one thing to do. I think another thing can be, it's difficult because I think it can be really hard. But kind of on that same topic, I think try and steer clear of the kind of common, I think like feminized language that's in mental health at the moment. I think so like I mentioned with Dave earlier, where it's always like a poem with like footprints in the sand and stuff. I think one thing that helped me, and I think helps a lot of people who are struggling with this, at least, you know, and when I'm saying this, there are a lot of men who don't have this masculinity thing, but just from my perspective, I try and use words like, you know, strength, and, you know, we're going to help you, rather than talk about what we're going to take away from you, that we're going to stop you thinking about being a man, stop you thinking about being muscular. Say what we're going to do is we're going to give you like the strength to feel okay with not having to do these things, and the strength to do this, and use those terms that make them still feel that you're not just taking everything away and telling them that they're going to be, you know, this like, you know, angel who can, you know, feel their emotions and be holistic. And, you know, it's all very like, you know, for someone who's struggling with that, it's all very like, this isn't for me. So that's another thing. Yeah, and I think another thing, I suppose, what's really useful is, and it isn't something I've really practiced myself, but, or maybe I haven't in some sense, but I think the literature looking at men speaking about their mental health tends to show that they do it better when it's a secondary action. So men tend to speak about their mental health when they're drinking with them, or in the pub, or men tend to speak about, this is actual like literature, I'm not just making this up. There's another one that's looking at men who are getting their hair cut, like at the barbers, they'll talk to their barber about their mental health. So, like, do another activity and then ask them how they're feeling, and talk, or even like share how you're feeling, so that then they feel comfortable to do so. But do it as a secondary act. Don't sit someone down who's struggling to talk about their mental health and say, we're going to talk about mental health, because that they just will not do it.
Yeah, I'm smiling and laughing just because this is how I have conversations with not just men, women as well. You know, if you're going to tackle something like this, do it on a walk, when you're not looking at one another face to face, and you're engaged in something and looking, and you know, it's strange, but there's something very having that distraction of something else going on, I think takes away some of the intensity from the conversation and the feeling of oh my gosh, I'm being stared at, and I'm like on the fire, you know, right in this moment. I guess I also want to ask you, you know, second part of that question is, if someone has a guy, and I'll just say a man in their life, just focus on that, because I think many people aren't sure, with a man, they're concerned about their eating behaviors or exercise behaviors, how to broach that topic of, okay, I've got a brother who is spending, you know, is at the gym twice a day, and is, you know, on a really crazy diet, and is on this, you know, fitness part of Reddit all the time. And I'm really concerned, and I don't, like, anytime I've mentioned it, he, you know, is just like, oh, it's not, you know, you're just jealous. You know, like, but how do you broach, especially with someone who maybe is swimming in that culture of toxic masculinity enough that they don't even recognize it as a problem? How, you know, do you have any tips for how to begin that conversation?
Yeah, and that's a really tough one. And I think, firstly, I want to say that, you know, and this is partly like something that really interests me in this topic is, I think the person you described there is very much towards the extreme, and therefore would, you know, we know that they've probably got a problem. But some people, they might be at it's a razor's edge, because, you know, these behaviors, the exercise and the diet and everything, like, we know inherently that they're good things, like they do benefit people's health. So, you know, for a lot of people, I think often they adopt these behaviors because they want to be healthier, or, you know, that's what at least they think, or, you know, maybe it is the truth. So, you know, I suppose, first of all, if you are worried about someone, you know, don't immediately diagnose them. And the reason I think I say that is, there are kind of three ways that people tend to start this conversation. The first, well, the first one is avoidant, which is someone else will deal with it, so I like I'm not going to bother. The second one is confrontational, which is where someone goes, I've diagnosed this person, I'm going to go tell them that they've got an eating disorder. And that's basically what, like, yeah, they do it in a roundabout way, but they basically go up to them and say, you've got a problem, like, I'm here to save you, like, and then that person tells them to, in so many words go away, and probably in more words than that, but and that doesn't work. But then there's the third way, which is the way you're supposed to do, which is the supportive way, which is where you go in and you recognize that we all, like you and me and everyone listening to this, have things that we do to try and deal with stress and worries in our lives, and maybe we've worked on it to try and come up with healthier ways of doing it, but we've all had problematic ways. We all probably still do. I definitely still have problematic ways that I deal with my mental health sometimes, and it's okay that they do too, potentially. And actually you're just there to talk to them as a fellow human who's trying to find a way to deal with stuff. And so with that, you can say to them, like, I've noticed you doing this all the time. Recently I watched this amazing webinar with a guy called George from MyoMinds and Chelsea, and they were incredible people, but you can leave a bit out, but you'll say, I watched this webinar and they were talking about men who struggle, no, you don't have to say struggle again because you don't want to use those words, but men who are exercising a lot and are doing this stuff, but then it seems to be that they actually have kind of things going on else in this, and I'm a bit worried about you, and maybe it's nothing, but could we talk about it and just see what's going on? Or even you could do that when you're in the gym with them, or doing something with them, and say, oh, the other day I watched this webinar where they're talking about guys who use this as a way to to cover up their mental health, or as a way to like feel better about themselves, and like, oh, do you think that's something do you think we do? I think maybe I see that in myself. What do you think? Or something like that. Again, that's again, you're doing it as a secondary thing there. But yeah, I think there are a couple good ways to do it. And like, I think, sorry, one more thing, if you follow me on MyoMinds, I'm sure if it comes out soon I can send it to you and you can put it in the link or something. But one of the tools that I'm making, the one that I mentioned before for GPs and for coaches and PTs, I think the coach PT one would be good for friends as well. And that'll be free online, so people can access that as well. And if you follow MyoMinds, I'll put it on our website and stuff as well, so it'll be there. But that'll be coming out soon. And we literally, the point of the one for coaches and PTs is, this is how you start that conversation. Like, here's a training course for that. So yeah, look out for that as well.
I love that. I love those recommendations, and I love the final suggestion you said, that that almost being, I listened to this podcast or this webinar or whatever it is, and self-reflecting on it. I think I see a bit of that in myself. I think that's so disarming. So the more you can make that conversation disarming, even sometimes you don't even have to say, I'm worried about you, but like, I listened to this, it's really interesting. Like, have a listen. What do you think? And then sometimes they'll listen, and maybe they self-reflect, or maybe that opens that tiny crack in the door where they can, they can share a little bit. So really, really great recommendations. I'm glad you also mentioned MyoMinds, because we're coming close to time and I want to be respectful of your time, and I could definitely talk to you for hours. So I've got to be mindful of it. But would you share, like, shameless plug time? But not just that, but if people are resonating with this conversation and interested in your work, what does MyoMinds do, and what does it offer? And then of course, where can they catch up with you and your work on social and all that stuff?
Yeah, so you can go to myominds.com or myominds.co.uk. You can I think you can get everything through there. MyoMinds is just me. I do have people who volunteer and help out, but the majority of stuff I do by myself. So it's not kept up to date as much as it probably should be, but I'm doing my best. You can get to the podcast through the website as well, or you can just go on any of the podcast players and type in MyoMinds podcast and it'll come up. Where I talk to people we have similar conversations to this, and I speak to researchers and people with experience and all sorts of people. Like I said, we do kind of research and tools, and you can see that. I'm currently working on something that is hopefully going to be a kind of guide for people who are in the gym around mental health and like what they can do kind of going forward. So look out for that, kind of in the midst of that. And yeah, it's been really nice to speak to you, Chelsea. And I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I just get so excited.
No, no, not at all. And I'm pleasantly surprised at how much. I mean, I knew there would be a lot to talk about, but I feel like we only scratched the surface. But what a great conversation, George. That was wonderful. So please do go and check out his website and his social handles, and we will end it there. So thank you, George, for taking the time to have this chat with me.
And thank you for taking the time to have a chat with me as well. Nice to speak to you.
You too.